Hey, good morning. Did you get into your word today? Let's do it. So today we are on Mark chapter 5 for our January challenge. So you already know we're reading the book of Mark for the month of January. Any of the resources that I've used will always be linked in the description box. And don't forget, comment the verses that stood out to you, and I'm going to tell you the ones that stood out to me. Let's get into it. The context of Mark chapter 5 is basically about fear and Jesus telling us to not be afraid. If you look at it, the very first story is about demons fearing Jesus. Let's get into the story. Now, I've always heard the story about the man who was possessed with demons, who lived in a graveyard, and God, Jesus, casted out these demons out of this man and sent the legion of demons into a bunch of pigs and allowed them to leave. But it's interesting to have the backstory of it all so that you can kind of put it into context. We're starting off by saying pigs were unclean and they weren't eaten by Jews. But it was a way for them to make money. So this kind of allows me to see the perspective of the crowd and to see why the pigs were chosen to have the demons sent into them. The man, he's in chapter 5, verse 1, where he literally lived in an area. He was possessed by demons, but he lived in burial sites. Nobody could contain this man. Whenever they tried to chain up his feet and his legs, he would clank them together to break the chains. In verse number 5, it talks about how day and night this man was wandering amongst burial sites in the hills, howling and cutting himself because of these demons that he was possessed with. When I was seen in my study Bible, legion, and what that means, because the Bible talks about he was possessed by a legion of demons, that in this time was between 3,000 to 6,000 soldiers. That was the meaning of a legion. So just imagine how many demons this man had possessed. If it ranged from 3,000 to 6,000, that's wild. Pastor preached about this before, and he talks about us and how us could relate because we sometimes stayed in dead places, like this man living in this burial site, walking there day and night, and how sometimes we stay in dead situations, dead things that Jesus is calling us out of, but we remain there and we allow ourselves to be possessed by the spirits of that environment. And it causes me to think while I'm reading this, are there any places in my life that Jesus has called me out of that are dead? Are there any places in my life that I'm operating in that are dead that God is calling me out of? Like you can get so much out of this story alone. So I strongly recommend, like I tell you guys all the time, to go back and read the word for yourself so that you can understand what God is telling you to do. Because I'm not a Bible scholar, baby. I'm just a girl trying to learn her word. So as I sit here and I'm reading it, I'm looking at it from the context for myself as this man being in a dead place, seeking Jesus. He wants to be healed. No one is even dealing with this man. Like nobody's talking to him. Everybody thinks he's crazy. Nobody's dealing with him. But when Jesus cast out the demons out of this man that was left for dead, literally these people left him for dead in a gravesite. Nobody wanted to help him because he was too strong. He resisted assistance. When Jesus actually healed him and sent every demon into these 2,000 pigs, and the pigs dived into a lakeside and drowned in the water. And when the people seen him in verse 14, they were astonished. They asked Jesus to leave. They said, it's time for you to go. Why would these people ask Jesus to leave after they've literally seen him heal this man that they've seen in dead places for years after years? Day and night, they've been afraid of this man. Day and night, they've seen him walking around dead places. They knew he was possessed. Why would they ask Jesus to leave? And when you think about it in context, these people made money off these pigs. Whether they ate the pigs or not, they made money, and they seen their money go into a lake and drown. The people were way more concerned about making money in their financials than they were about Jesus healing a man who had been struggling. That's sad, but it still happens today. Sometimes we are too worried about what's going on in our financial system, in our lives, to worry about the people that are struggling. And I feel like we've gotten that context through the book of Mark, even the story about the paralyzed man. And really, it just puts us into perspective. God, correct my heart posture if that's me. What's also kind of eye-opening is that a lot of times when Jesus performs miracles, he tells the people to be quiet and not tell anybody. But with the demon-possessed man, in verse number 18, he asked the demon-possessed man, the one he's cleansed, he's good. He was sitting there clothed and fully sane. Everybody's seen it. He asked to go with Jesus. And I can understand why he would ask to go with Jesus, because you've been alone for so long. Nobody around you wanted to deal with you. And now you have someone who came to you and cares about you and loves you and wants to take care of you and heal you. He wants to go with Jesus, but Jesus says, no, I need you to go back and tell him. I need you to go back and say something. The Bible says that Jesus told this man to tell his friends about the miraculous healing, but most of the time Jesus would urge those he healed to keep quiet. But what is the difference? Number one, the demon-possessed man had been alone and unable to speak. Telling others what Jesus did for him would prove that he had healed him and give him a chance to be accepted back into society, find work, and be reunited with family and friends. Number two, this mainly Gentile and pagan area. So Jesus didn't expect a great crowd of people to follow him or religious leaders to hinder him. Number three, by sending the man away with the good news, Jesus was expanding his ministry to people who were not Jews. This man was the first missionary to the Gentiles. That's so good to know. Through Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43, we hear some other common stories that we've heard, and we definitely heard a few of them in the book of Matthew. Number one was the story about the bleeding woman. And I noticed the bleeding woman, if you don't recall, this was a woman who seen Jesus in a crowd. She was bleeding for 12 years, possibly some sort of something to do with her menstrual cycle or something of that nature. She was considered unclean, so no one would touch her. No one could heal her. And she got on her hands and knees and touched the cloth of Jesus's, the hem of his garment, and just said, if I can touch the hem of his garment, I will be healed. Her faith allowed her to be healed. Jesus stopped in the middle of the crowd and said, who touched me? She was like, it was me. And Jesus said, you're healed because of your faith, because she literally didn't worry about the crowds and what the crowd was doing. She was so focused on getting closer to God. If that required her to get on her hands and knees and go in the middle of a crowd of people, she did that to get closer to God, to be healed. She knew that her faith saved her. And then we have Jairus, I think his name is Jairus or Jairus, and his daughter was sick, and she too was 12 years old. So in my mind, I'm wondering, what's the significance between 12? Apparently, the significance between 12 is perfect union. Crazy, right? The number 12 signifies divine order and God's government. I had to double check that because I said it wrong a few times, so my apologies. But that's what it symbolizes, which is also good to keep in the back of your mind when you're reading it. So in the story about the young girl, Jairus, he is actually a synagogue leader, and his daughter is sick, and so he knows Jesus is coming. He's wanting his help because obviously, if he is a synagogue leader, he has resources to doctors, he has resources to people helping, but no one can help his daughter. So he sends word for Jesus to come. Now, when Jesus comes, there's a crowd of people at his house mourning, right? And Jesus says, "Why y'all crying? Because she's not dead; she's asleep." And Jesus is like, he tells the crowd this, and the crowd starts laughing. The crowd in Jairus' house starts laughing when Jesus says the little girl sleeps. So he sends the crowd out, and he heals the little girl, and he tells them to keep the secret quiet. I can only imagine that even in this intimate setting, your child Jairus is passing away, and I'm sure that you don't have a crowd of strangers around you in this intimate moment. I'm sure you have her family and your friends and people that are close to you around you. And then when Jesus walks into the environment and they laugh at what he's saying, I can understand how that would make me furious, to be honest. But it also reminds me of the importance of not listening to the crowd. I mean, if we think about it, the first crowd that you experienced in Mark chapter 5 was a crowd of people who watched this man suffer for years on years on years. But when they seen the healer, they wanted to send him away. Then number two, you have a young lady who has been bleeding for 12 years. And because she has to get on her hands and knees to go past a crowd of people to get closer to God, she ignores the crowd. And then number three, you have an intimate circle of people around this young girl who is dying. And when Jesus says a word, they laugh at it. Baby, I don't know about you, but it makes me want to watch who I surround myself with, because I want to surround myself with people who are praying to God and getting on their hands and knees with me when I'm going through something, so I'm not alone. I want to be around people who don't look at my circumstance, but they look at me as a person. And for me, that's just what that reminds me of. Your crowd is so important. But let me know what you got out of Mark chapter 5, and I will see you tomorrow for Mark chapter 6. You guys have an amazing day. Bye.